The wind rattled the loose boards of the shack like an old ghost trying to get in. Inside, the girl sat with her back against the cold wall, arms wrapped tightly around the bundle of blankets that barely muffled the soft breaths of her baby brother. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. He hadn't cried in one. The world beyond the cracks in the wood was all dust and silence, save for the groan of the wind and the distant howl of something wild. She didn't know how long it had been since her mother left. Time had stretched thin and brittle like thread pulled too tight. At first, she counted the hours. Then the days. Then she stopped. No footsteps came. No voices called. Only the wind, always the wind. The fire had long since gone out. Her belly no longer begged, it just ached like something hollowed out. And still, she held the child against her chest as if her thin arms could keep him alive by will alone. Her name had started to fade in her own mind. What mattered now was his breath. His warmth. The rise and fall beneath the patchwork quilt that smelled of ash and old milk. And then, sometime near dusk, when the wind began to shift and the sky went gold, she heard it. A footstep. Slow. Heavy. Not mother. Not any voice she remembered. But real. The latch creaked. The door pushed in. And there, framed by the dying light, stood a man whose shadow filled the room like a thunderstorm. She didn't scream. She didn't speak. Because somehow she knew it. The wind hadn't brought a threat. It had brought a reckoning. The shack sat alone on the edge of nowhere, leaning against the wind like a tired man who had forgotten why he stood. It had once been painted, maybe blue, maybe green, but time and weather had stripped it bare, leaving only splinters and stories in the wood. The roof sagged in the middle. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. And the windows, covered with old cloth and nailed boards, let in more dust than light. Nothing about the place looked like it could hold life anymore. And yet inside it did. She was small, too small for the weight she carried. Her arms were thin, her face hollowed by hunger, but her eyes stayed open long after they should have closed. There was no time to sleep. No safety in it. Not when the nights howled and the floor creaked with the settling of age and cold. She sat on the dirt floor with her back against the wall, a tattered blanket wrapped around her legs, and her baby brother pressed to her chest like a secret she couldn't afford to lose. The child slept often now, more from exhaustion than comfort. His breath was light, almost not there. She would lean in close every so often, her ear to his nose, just to make sure he was still breathing. When he stirred, she held him tighter. When he whimpered, she hummed a tune she no longer remembered the words to. Her voice had gone hoarse days ago, but she kept humming anyway. It wasn't for him. Not really. It was for her. To keep the silence from swallowing her whole. There had been a time not long ago when she'd heard voices in this place. Her mother's voice whispering as she rocked the baby. Her father's boots outside the door, heavy and certain. Laughter, even. The kind that filled the cracks in the walls and made the shack feel like something more than ruin. But all of that had slipped away like mist burned off by the sun. First her father, gone without a word. Then her mother, promising to return with bread and firewood, walking into the wind and not coming back. The laughter had been the first thing to vanish. Then the warmth. Now it was just the cold. She didn't cry anymore. Crying wasted strength. Instead, she conserved her energy like an animal in winter, moving only when necessary, breathing slow, thinking slower. She had learned how to make a fire with damp kindling. She had learned how to stretch a heel of bread into 3 meals. She had learned which parts of the floor were safest to sleep on, which corners leaked less when it rained, and how to fold the blanket just right so her brother stayed warm through the night. But the firewood had run out. The bread too. And though she searched the surrounding woods for roots, for berries, for anything, she found nothing. The land was dry and brittle like something long forgotten by God. Even the birds no longer flew overhead. The sky remained empty. Each day she would open the door and stare out at the field that stretched flat and endless before her. The grass had gone yellow, the trees in the distance nothing more than skeletons scraping the sky. She would wait just a few minutes, watching, hoping, listening for footsteps, for hooves, for a voice calling her name. But all she ever heard was the wind. Inside, the walls moaned with each gust. The boards shifted like tired bones. Dust danced in the rays of light that crept through the gaps. Sometimes she imagined shapes in the movement, faces, arms, people leaning toward her. But they never stayed. They were just tricks of light like shadows on water. Her brother stirred in her arms. His eyes fluttered open, then closed again. He hadn't cried in nearly a full day. She counted his breaths, her lips moving silently with each one. 30, 31, 32. The numbers were her only anchor. When she reached 50, she started again. It made her feel like she had control. Like she could keep him alive if she just kept counting. The nights were the hardest. That was when the cold crept in like a thief, stealing warmth from everything it touched. Her fingers had gone numb. Her lips cracked. She wrapped the baby tighter, curled around him like a shield, her own body slowly turning into the last barrier between life and whatever came after. Her eyes would close for seconds at a time, only to snap open when a board creaked or the wind howled a little too close. She dreamed in flashes now of her mother's face, of warm bread on a table, of light pouring through open windows. But always, the dreams ended with silence. With the door still shut. With the wind blowing and the fire cold. Days blended into each other. Hunger turned into something quieter, duller. Her stomach no longer complained, it simply waited. She stopped marking the time. Stopped asking the sky for help. The wind had become her only companion, its song constant, its presence unavoidable. She wondered if maybe the wind had taken her mother, or her father, or both. Maybe they had walked into it, disappeared like smoke, become part of the air. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast the world in gold, she sat by the door with the baby swaddled in her arms. The last of the warmth from the day touched her face through the cracks in the boards. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She only listened. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the wind changed. It shifted from its usual shriek to something softer, rounder. The scent of dust gave way to something else, sweat, leather, smoke. A new sound joined it, the slow crunch of boots on dry earth. Her breath caught. She didn't move. Not yet. Then the latch rattled. The door creaked open. And the light behind the silhouette was the color of fire. The man who stepped into the shack brought the outside with him, the dust, the scent of sweat and saddle, the low hum of earth-beaten leather. For a long moment he didn't move, just stood in the doorway with the wind curling around him like smoke. He wasn't young, not quite old, his figure shaped by hard seasons and miles that left no part of him untouched. His coat, long and cracked with sun, hung off his shoulders like it belonged to someone else. His boots, caked with red dust, made no sound as he took his first step onto the dirt floor. The girl didn't shift. She kept her brother pressed against her chest, her eyes wide, body unmoving but alert, like a deer frozen in snow. There was no room left for panic. Panic had come and gone in the earlier days, now there was only stillness, the last refuge of those with nothing left to lose. The man scanned the small room, eyes lingering on the corners, on the bent nails in the boards, the cold hearth, the threadbare blanket bunched beneath the girl's feet. His gaze wasn't hurried. It moved with the weight of someone used to silence, someone who knew the stories told in how a room smelled, how a fire died, how a child clutched at what little remained. He crouched down, not close. Not yet, and laid something on the floor. A leather satchel, scuffed and misshapen. The kind that had traveled further than most men. Then he stood again and backed toward the wall. Just enough to let the girl see his hands, empty and still. The light from the doorway flickered and dimmed as the wind shifted, stirring ash from the cold fireplace, scattering it like memory. Dust caught in the beams, turned to gold for a second before vanishing again. The man didn't speak. He didn't reach. Instead, he lowered himself slowly to the ground near the wall, folding his legs beneath him like someone settling in for a vigil. Time passed differently after that. The room seemed to breathe, exhaling something it had held too long. The baby stirred. The girl didn't notice at first, but then his weight shifted against her chest and she glanced down. He blinked, then squirmed softly, and a thin cry rose in his throat. A weak, rasping sound that barely echoed in the stale air. She rocked him gently, her arms practiced and certain even in their exhaustion. The man did not flinch. He watched with something like reverence. When the crying faded and the child rested again, he reached slowly for the satchel he had placed. The leather creaked as he opened it, revealing something wrapped in cloth, something that released the scent of jerky and cooked beans. He set it carefully on the ground between them and leaned back again. The girl's eyes narrowed, not with fear but with calculation. Hunger had taught her to see the world in terms of cost. Everything had a price, food most of all. But the man's expression didn't ask for anything. Not even trust. Just time. Outside, the wind died down for a while. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the gusts that had come before. As if the land itself had paused, listening. The girl finally shifted, her legs stiff from staying in one position too long. She reached for the food, not quickly, but with a caution shaped by more than hunger. Her fingers brushed the cloth, then drew it to her lap. She didn't unwrap it immediately. She looked at the man once more. He met her eyes without blinking, and then looked away, as though giving her permission to disappear into her task. She ate in small bites, mechanical, without indulgence. The food was dry but real, heavy in her mouth, almost unfamiliar. She didn't stop to savor it. She ate for strength, not comfort. When she finished, she left nothing behind. Not a crumb, not a single thread of wrapping. The baby didn't stir again. His breath was shallow but steady, curled tight against her like a limb she could not lose. The man stayed silent. The sun sank lower, and the light through the cracks shifted from gold to rust. Eventually, the girl's eyelids grew heavy. She didn't mean to sleep. She didn't want to, but sleep found her anyway, as it sometimes did when the body could no longer hold its vigil. Her head tilted forward, her arms locked around the child, and her breathing settled into the rhythm of dreamless rest. The man watched without moving. Later, long after darkness had swallowed the last of the light, he rose. Not with noise but like a shadow changing shape. He moved toward the hearth and examined it quietly. The ashes told him everything. How long the fire had gone cold. What had burned last. Whether it had been fueled by timber or scraps of cloth. He knelt and began to rebuild it with pieces from his pack. Small bits of tinder, thin shavings of dry bark, a chunk of pine resin wrapped in paper. When the first spark caught, he coaxed it slowly, feeding it like a child learning to breathe again. The light grew, dancing along the walls. It painted the girl's face in amber and shadow. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. The baby shifted in her arms. The fire caught fully now, sending warmth into corners that hadn't known heat in weeks. The man sat back against the wall again, letting the glow wash over him. Through the holes in the boards, the stars blinked down, cold and bright. The wind began to stir again. Not harsh, but steady, like a presence making itself known. The man tilted his head slightly, listening. Not to sound, but to the weight in the air. He didn't move after that. He only watched the fire burn and the children sleep and the shack breathe again for the first time in what felt like forever. Morning did not arrive with the sun so much as it crept in slowly, cautiously, like someone afraid to disturb what it found. The first light was faint, barely a hint of gold brushing the edges of the boarded windows and filtering through the gaps like dust in reverse. It touched the rough floor, lingered on the smoke-stained walls, and settled on the girl's face where she lay curled tightly around her brother. Her breathing was shallow but steady. The kind of sleep that came not from peace but exhaustion, the kind earned rather than given. The man had not slept. He remained by the fire, which had long since quieted to a nest of orange coals. His back rested against the wall, arms crossed, head bowed in the posture of someone used to watching over things. The silence in the room was no longer the hollow, empty silence of abandonment. It was a quietness that had shape, texture, a rhythm shared by breath and flickering ember. He watched the children sleep as one might watch the tide, expectant, patient, certain that something would change even if he did nothing at all. The girl stirred first. Her head lifted slightly, her eyes blinking against the dim light. She did not panic. Instead, she did what she always did, she listened. To the fire, to the wind, to the breathing beneath her chin. Then, slowly, she lifted her face and looked across the room. He was still there. Unmoving. Real. She studied him like an animal deciding whether to flee or stay. Her arms tightened around her brother. She didn't speak. Words were too scarce to waste. The man nodded once. A gesture without expectation, a signal that asked nothing in return. Then, without standing, he reached beside him and took something from the satchel. This time it was a small tin cup and a battered canteen. He poured water into the cup, set it near the fire to warm, and then placed it gently beside a strip of cloth and a square of hard bread. The movements were deliberate, slow, almost reverent. When he finished, he folded his hands in his lap and looked away, giving her space to choose. The girl did not reach for the food right away. She waited, letting the warmth of the fire crawl toward her slowly. Her bones still ached from the cold. Her fingers curled tight around the baby's form, checking again that he was still there, still breathing. When his breath shuddered once in his chest, she pressed her lips to his forehead, whispering something too soft to hear. Then, as if deciding that the silence had granted permission, she slowly rose to her knees and moved toward the tin. The warmth of the water against her fingertips made her pause. It was nothing like the cold streams she had known. This felt alive, like something offered. She sipped, careful not to wake the boy, and then dipped the cloth into the cup, pressing it gently to her brother's lips. He stirred, and for the first time in days, a small sound escaped him. It was not a cry, not even a whimper, just the soft exhale of life returning from somewhere far away. She tore the bread in two, setting half aside, and held a piece to his mouth. He did not take it, too weak or too small to understand. So she chewed it herself, broke it down slowly, then passed it to him through her fingers like a mother bird to its nestling. It was awkward, clumsy, but it worked. The boy swallowed. And for the first time since their mother had vanished, she felt something inside her lift, just slightly. Like a window cracked after a long storm. The man made no sound. He only watched. Not with hunger or pity, but with the kind of gaze one uses when looking at a flame in the dark, aware that it could go out at any moment and knowing there was no greater task than keeping it alive. When the children had eaten all they could, the girl wiped the boy's mouth with the hem of her sleeve and tucked the blanket tighter around him. She did not smile, but something softer had settled into her face, some line of tension that had eased without notice. The wind had changed again. It no longer screamed through the cracks. Now it murmured, a steady hush that moved through the dry grass and rattled the boards like the breath of something old and watching. The day outside was gray and heavy with the weight of a coming storm. The air smelled like rain even though the sky had not yet broken. The man stood then, slow and quiet, brushing dust from his coat. He crossed the room and opened the door, letting the light in. The land beyond was empty but wide, a flat horizon drawn in tones of rust and ash. He stepped outside without looking back. The girl stayed seated, watching him from the threshold. She expected him to mount a horse, to ride away and disappear like every other soul that had come and gone. But he didn't. He moved to the edge of the shack and began gathering wood from a pile half buried in wind-blown debris. With measured effort, he returned, stacking the pieces by the hearth. Then he cleared a space in the corner, laying out a tarp and setting down supplies, dried meat, salt, matches, small things that meant survival. She didn't stop him. She didn't speak. But she watched every movement. As afternoon slid quietly toward dusk, he began working outside, repairing the fence that had long since collapsed, checking the water barrel, patching the cracked boards on the shack's outer wall. All without explanation, all with the certainty of someone who had decided to stay, at least for now. Inside, the fire burned higher. The baby had fallen asleep again, his face pink with warmth and his hands twitching in dreams. The girl sat beside him, staring not at the man, but at the door, open now, no longer the barrier it had once been. The wind passed through freely, brushing her face with a gentleness it hadn't known before. She didn't understand why the man had come, or what debt he owed to this place. But for the first time in a long stretch of days and hunger and silence, she believed that something had shifted. Not just in the shack, not just in the sky, but in the air between people. In the space where one soul recognized another. In the quiet that came before the naming of a new beginning. Rain came quietly that night, not in torrents, but in a slow, rhythmic tapping that settled into the roof as if the sky itself was trying to soothe what had been broken. The girl lay on the dirt floor, the baby warm and still against her chest, both of them wrapped tightly in the blanket that had long since stopped smelling like anything but smoke and time. The fire crackled low and the shadows danced high along the walls, flickering against wood warped by years of wind and weather. She did not sleep deeply, but she drifted in and out of half-dreams, lulled by the sounds of rain and breath and ember. Outside, the man sat beneath the overhang of the shack, his back to the wall, his hat pulled low over his brow. He watched the rain the way some men watch fire, closely, with memory and with something almost like longing. Morning came slow, like honey poured too thick to move. The world outside the shack glistened, every blade of grass crowned with silver drops, every rock darkened and softened by moisture. The girl stepped out barefoot, the cold earth biting at her soles, but she didn't flinch. She stood on the threshold, the blanket still wrapped around her thin shoulders, the baby asleep behind her on a pile of dry rags. The man was already moving, already mending the eastern side of the shack where the rain had found a way in. His tools were simple, nails hammered in with the back of a knife, a splintered board reinforced with an extra layer of canvas and pitch. She watched him for a long time, not out of suspicion anymore, but out of quiet curiosity, the way a child watches the tide to see if it always comes back. He worked without sound, the kind of labor that came from habit more than instruction. Each movement was purposeful, unhurried, practiced. She watched how he moved, how he tested the strength of each board with a press of his palm, how he stepped wide so as not to leave prints near the door, how he never turned his back completely toward the shack. Trust, even in kindness, came slow in these parts. By noon, the rain had passed, and with it came a fragile warmth that clung to the ground but never reached the wind. The girl ventured further from the shack, only a few steps at first. She crouched beside the patch of soil where her mother once grew onions, now overrun with weeds and long dead roots. Her fingers brushed the dirt, not digging, not planting, just remembering. She looked back toward the shack, toward the man now splitting dry kindling beside the door, and something shifted in her spine, a release, like breath after a long-held note. She didn't speak, but she picked up a small stick and began drawing shapes in the mud. Circles. Lines. A face. That afternoon, the man caught a rabbit with a snare line he'd set near the edge of the tree line. He didn't say anything when he returned with it. He just cleaned it with quiet precision and placed the meat over the fire. The smell filled the shack slowly, curling into the beams, seeping into the blankets, reaching even the baby's nose, who stirred and whimpered softly before settling again. The girl ate cautiously, one bite at a time, her eyes flicking between the flames and the man. She left nothing on the tin plate. Hunger made no room for ceremony. As the days passed, routine returned like a ghost who remembered its way home. Each morning, the man stepped outside before the sun crested the hills. Each evening, he returned with something: wood, berries, once even a bird's egg tucked carefully in a cloth. The girl followed his movements with silent attention. She never asked where he came from or why he stayed. She had learned that some answers didn't need words. His presence was steady, and in a world where everything else had vanished like smoke, steadiness was enough. One night, as the wind rose again and the fire danced higher than usual, the girl began to hum. It was a broken melody, the kind that children carry from places they no longer remember. Her voice cracked in places, faded in others, but she hummed anyway, rocking the baby in her lap, eyes half closed. The man didn't interrupt. He sat quietly at the far end of the shack, his face lit by firelight, his hands still. The song wasn't for him. It wasn't even for the child. It was for the room, for the walls, for the ghosts that lived in the silence between night and morning. That was the first night she didn't check the door latch 3 times before lying down. The first night she let herself fall asleep before the baby did. The man placed another log on the fire as the last note of her hum faded, then lay back with his hat pulled low, letting the wind speak whatever truths it carried through the cracks. In the days that followed, the land itself seemed to shift. A single green shoot sprouted near the edge of the garden patch. Birds began to circle high overhead. And one morning, when the girl stepped outside with the blankets still clinging to her shoulders, she found a set of footprints that were not the man's, small, bird-like, trailing near the barrel where rainwater collected. Life, in its quiet way, was returning. Still, she said nothing. She kept her voice locked tight, the way her mother had told her to do when the world grew uncertain. But her eyes began to follow the man differently now, not just with wariness, but with questions that had no shape yet. Who he was. What he had lost. Why he knew how to wait. Why he hadn't left. One afternoon, she found him sitting by the creek with a knife in one hand and a piece of wood in the other. He wasn't carving anything specific, just whittling for the sake of motion, letting the shavings fall like snow onto his boots. She stood a few feet away, watching. He offered her the knife by holding it out flat across his palm. She hesitated, then stepped forward and took it. She didn't know how to carve. Not really. But she mimicked his movements, slowly, cautiously. The wood splintered once, then twice, but she didn't stop. The blade felt strange in her hand, too sharp, too powerful, but she kept at it. The man said nothing, just watched as she cut the air with her silence. When the sun began to fall, she handed the knife back, her fingers blistered, the wood misshapen but real. She held onto the carving, whatever it was, as if it might someday mean something more than just a piece of timber touched by both of them. The wind returned that night with a howl, louder than before, scraping the tin roof and making the shack groan like an old ship at sea. The baby whimpered in his sleep, and the girl held him close. But she didn't light the fire again. She didn't wake the man. She just watched the shadows crawl along the wall and listened to the wind's song. And somewhere deep in the rising noise, she heard something new. Not a threat, not a warning, but a promise. That the wind that had once taken so much might now be carrying something back. The fifth morning came with an air that felt different. Not colder, not warmer, just still. Like the world was holding its breath for something not yet visible. The man rose before the sun again, his movements now more routine than deliberate. Each motion carried a quiet purpose, a familiarity that had grown over the past days like moss on stone. The girl lay curled beside her brother, her body forming a protective crescent around him, both wrapped in the worn blanket that had become their world. She was not fully asleep, not fully awake. Her eyes blinked slowly in the half-light, tracking the man's steps as he prepared for whatever it was that called him beyond the doorway each morning. He did not speak. He never had. And yet something passed between them now. A silent language carved out of shared days, simple gestures, and unspoken understanding. When he left the shack that morning, she did not watch from the doorway. She remained where she was, the baby tucked against her ribs, her face turned to the wall as if listening to something no one else could hear. Outside, the world was painted in hues of rust and silver. The rain had passed, but the earth was still soaked through, releasing the scent of life and decay in equal measure. The man checked his traps, tended to the makeshift pen where he had begun mending a corner post, and studied the horizon like a reader studies the last line of a letter. The wind had shifted again, blowing not from the west as usual, but from the north, and with it came a sharp edge, metallic, dry warning. He paused beside a stand of low pine and scanned the valley. There was nothing out of place. No movement, no birds scattered, no trail dust rising. Yet the feeling remained. A hum beneath the ribs, a pressure behind the eyes, as if something was near, but just beyond the reach of sight. He turned back toward the shack, his boot prints deep in the soft mud, and for the first time in days, he closed the door behind him. Inside, the fire was already lit. She had done it herself. A small blaze, carefully tended, a kettle suspended above it on a bent rod. The baby lay sleeping near the hearth, his cheeks flushed with heat, his breath slow but steady. The girl sat cross-legged by the fire, the carving from before clutched in her hand. It had become smoother now, worn down from hours of holding, her thumb polishing the curves into something less jagged, less uncertain. The man removed his coat and hung it on the peg by the door. Then he crossed the room and crouched beside the fire, checking the kettle, adding another split log. She didn't look at him, but she didn't pull away either. The closeness no longer felt like a threat. It was becoming habit, a shape her body recognized without resistance. As the hours passed, they worked in tandem. The man outside, reinforcing the window frames, sorting through the scattered debris along the edge of the shack. The girl inside, tidying the small space, folding blankets, feeding her brother with small spoonfuls of thin broth. Each task done without instruction, each act part of an unspoken pact. You survive, I'll stay. That afternoon, a new sound drifted on the wind. Hooves, distant, faint, not many. The girl froze. Her eyes shot to the door, then to the man who had already paused, his hand resting on the frame, his body angled slightly as if to catch the vibration before the sound itself arrived. He didn't move. Not yet. He waited. The hooves came closer, not hurried, not charging, but steady, too steady. Familiarity was in the rhythm. Whoever approached had traveled far. and they weren't in a rush. The girl stood slowly, wrapping the blanket around her brother and stepping back into the shadows of the shack. Her eyes didn't leave the man. She wasn't afraid the way she had once been, but fear had many faces. And this one looked like memory, like old danger. The first rider appeared just as the sun broke through the clouds. A tall figure on a tired horse, wrapped in a long coat that blended into the dust. Then another, and another. Not 50, not yet, but enough to make the earth tremble beneath their weight. They didn't approach with weapons drawn. They didn't shout or make demands. They simply rode forward until they could see the shack clearly, then stopped in a wide arc, watching. The man stepped out slowly, his hands open at his sides. He didn't wave. He didn't challenge. He stood still, grounded in the space between the riders and the girl inside. One of the riders dismounted. An older man, his braids wrapped in cloth, face marked with lines not just of age, but history. He walked forward slowly, stopping a few paces away from the cowboy. They stood in silence, the kind that stretches years wide, the kind that lets the past speak through scars. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The old man looked past the cowboy toward the shack, toward the child peering from the dark. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion that carried the weight of something larger than gratitude. Then he turned, walked back to his horse, and rode off. The others followed, one by one, until the valley was quiet again. The man did not move until the last hoofbeat had faded. When he turned back toward the shack, the girl had stepped outside. She stood with her brother in her arms, the blanket loose now, her hair catching in the wind. She didn't speak, but something in her eyes asked a question. The man nodded once, not in answer, but in understanding. That night, they didn't light the fire early. They waited until the stars were fully overhead, until the air was cool and still. Then, as the flames rose, the girl placed the carving beside the fire. It was smoother now, almost shaped into something that could be named. She didn't try to finish it. Not yet. She just let it rest near the warmth. The man sat across from her. The child lay curled between them. And for the first time since the wind had carried him into their world, the shack no longer felt like a shelter from the world outside. It felt like a place becoming whole. A place that might hold. A place that might stay. The light on the sixth morning was different, clearer, sharper, as though the world had been washed clean overnight, and now every leaf, every blade of grass, every worn slat in the shack's walls stood with new definition. There was no wind, no sound of distant riders, no threat crouched behind the horizon. Only the long breath of stillness that settles after a storm has passed, not just through the land, but through people. The girl stood barefoot at the edge of the porch, arms wrapped around her brother, both of them facing east where the sun broke low and gold across the prairie. The blanket had slipped off her shoulders, forgotten in the moment. Her eyes were open wide, not with fear but with presence. She saw everything now. Inside the shack, the man packed supplies into 2 burlap sacks. Salted meat, dried apples, leftover cornmeal, a few strips of cloth. He moved without rush, but with purpose, his shoulders loose, his hands steady. The small fire in the hearth had burned low overnight, and now only pale smoke drifted upward, curling toward the rafters before disappearing through the cracks. The space inside looked different too, tidier, lived in, like something reclaimed instead of abandoned. He stepped outside and set the bags down near the door. The girl turned toward him, one hand still holding her brother close, the other now gripping a carved piece of wood, the same one she'd shaped over days, smoothing its edges, letting its meaning form slowly in her hands. It resembled a bird now, wings outstretched, caught in a moment of flight frozen in time. She didn't offer it. She simply held it there, as though it were a part of her, as much as the boy she carried. The man nodded to her, the same silent language they had shared since the beginning, a gesture of readiness. Not command, not farewell, something quieter, an invitation. They would leave today. The sun climbed higher as they made their way across the flatlands. The girl rode the small mule he had found 2 days earlier, half-starved when discovered but sturdy after feed and rest. She sat upright, her brother cradled in her lap, the bird carving tucked into the folds of the blanket. The man walked beside them, one hand loosely holding the rope, the other resting on his hip near the water flask. They didn't speak. Words weren't necessary anymore. The land around them spoke enough, wide and open, the wind no longer a warning but a whisper of distance and direction. They passed the line of pines where he had once set traps, now emptied and left open, no longer needed. A small cairn stood near the base of the hill, a pile of stones built carefully by the girl during the last few evenings, without reason, without plan. A marker for something only she understood. A grave for something unseen. They didn't stop, but both looked as they passed. By midday, the sun was sharp against the earth, the shadows drawn long and clear beneath them. They reached the creek by early afternoon, where water still ran shallow and cold. The man stopped there to let the mule drink. The girl climbed down and sat by the edge, dipping her hand into the water, letting it run between her fingers, over her wrist, up her arm as she lifted it to wash her brother's face. The baby blinked but didn't cry. His eyes were clearer now, less dull, more alive. His cheeks had color again. He reached for her necklace, the thin leather cord she wore tucked beneath her dress, the only thing she had kept from before. She let him tug at it, let him hold on. The man refilled the canteen, then crouched beside her, watching the horizon. He didn't look at her directly, but he didn't have to. They were bound now. Not by blood. Not even by choice. But by a thing forged in silence and necessity, in the act of staying when others left. He picked up a flat stone and handed it to her. She skipped it across the water without looking, and when it bounced once, twice, and sank, her mouth curved slightly, not a smile, not fully, but something that lived in the same family as hope. They continued traveling into the late afternoon, the sky overhead a pale sweep of lavender and rose. The land grew softer, the terrain less sharp. Trees began to dot the landscape, their shadows stretching long across the path. The girl began to hum again, the tune older than memory, the note small and imperfect, shaped by hunger and time and now healing. Her brother curled against her chest, his breathing slow and rhythmic. The mule moved at an even pace, steady under the sun. By the time dusk settled, they reached the edge of a small rise, and there below them was another structure, not a shack, not quite a house. Something in between. Faded paint, a sloping roof, smoke rising from a chimney. It looked like it had been abandoned once and then found again. The girl said nothing, but she sat straighter. The man led the mule down the slope, guiding it gently until they reached the fence. A woman stepped out onto the porch. She was older, her hair pulled back in a braid streaked with gray. Her eyes searched the figures below, and for a moment, no one moved. Then the woman nodded once and turned back inside, leaving the door open behind her. They didn't speak as they approached. The girl dismounted and held her brother tightly, her bare feet landing soft on the earth. She looked back once, back toward the rise, toward the land behind them, toward everything that had come before. And then she turned and walked through the open door. Inside was warmth. A new kind. The kind built from stoves and rugs and lived in corners. The kind that smelled of herbs and dust and fresh bread. She stopped just inside, unsure, the baby blinking at the light. The woman said nothing. She simply motioned toward the fire where a basket of cloth waited. A place for a child to rest. The girl lowered him gently into the makeshift bed, covering him with the blanket, tucking the carving beside his hand. He curled instantly as if he had always known this place. She sat beside him, her back straight, her face unreadable. But her eyes never left him. The man stood in the doorway a long while, watching both of them. Then he stepped outside and closed the door gently behind him. The girl didn't follow. She stayed near the fire as night deepened, the shadows settling once again, but this time softer, kinder, more forgiving. She watched the baby breathe, the fire flicker, the light play against the walls. She was no longer afraid of silence. Not this kind. Not here. Outside, the wind picked up again, but it carried no threat. Just distance. Just sky. Just the whisper of something gone and something beginning all at once.